Morning. Let's get started with Martus and annual budget preparations for fiscal year 23. Through our agenda today, we'll be covering a small overview on the tribal policies on budget proposals, a quick look at what the different budget types we have, an overview of Martus and the budgets, and then we'll actually get into the different methods of preparing our budget proposals. And then we'll close it out with the supporting documentation to make sure we include with our drafts. So in the accounting manual, it outlines this as our procedure for annual budget preparation. Program directors, division heads are going to be responsible for preparing the budget, particularly 638 contracts that we'll be working with SRD. The finance manager is responsible for the indirect cost and general fund budgets, but it also aggregates all of the prepared budget proposals that everyone's going to submit to Martus. Those aggregated budgets are given to Budget and Finance, and they'll review all budget proposals, determine reasonableness in relation to goals and objectives of the tribe, and verify revenues are sufficient to match budgeting requests and send those forward to council, who reviews those for final approval before they are released. So similar to Intact, Martus is going to function off the basis of the tribe's fiscal year, which means October 1st through September 30th. And a little bit different than Intact and Martus, we have to actually filter from one fiscal year to the next to be able to access our budgets. Some of our programs have funds that don't operate within that year, but for budgeting purposes, they'll be using the tribe's fiscal year to be able to prepare and submit their budgets. We use the worksheets area of Martus, not the change request area. So we'll navigate there today and we can see that. And we've been doing this now for a few years, so hopefully everybody knows where to go. But even still with last year's budgets, we had programs prepare change requests instead of submitting their budget through the worksheets. If they're not submitted through the worksheets area of Martus, your budget will not be presented to Budget and Finance or to Council for consideration. So that can cause a little bit of a delay for your program or cause some confusion as to why you submitted your budget, but other people aren't seeing it. And I think Lynette sent an email out yesterday and another today. The proposals this year are due in June. Here's the different budget types that we have. Tried to color code these. So the blue ones, general indirect casino revenue and federal and or state grants. These are the types of budgets that are going to operate within the tribe's fiscal year. And these are for those that do not last multiple years. So like these federal and or state grants, these are single year grants. These are the programs who are going to have a new budget to prepare each fiscal year. They use the fiscal year report in Intact for their finances. BIA, IHS, and then federal or state contracts. These are the ones that last multiple years. They're going to use the life to date financial reports. And then lastly, there are federal and state grants that do not follow the tribe's fiscal year. They may not even be a multi-year contract, but they'll have to use the life to date financial report because their data might overlay through two different tribal fiscal years. Regardless of that, all of our budgets will be prepared for fiscal year 23 using fiscal year 23. As we get ready to prepare our new budgets to meet that June deadline, if we're going to have new grant awards, new contracts, or we need a new funding source, we need to make sure we reach out to our program monitor first so they can make sure those get added before you start working on your new proposal. Those funding sources will not be available in Martus until they're created. So once you work with the monitor and get verification that they're in and now you know what number to use, then we can get into Martus and start preparing our budget. If we need a new funding source, but we jump into Martus before we know that it's ready, we may end up proposing a budget under an old funding source, causing a minor delay or confusion as to why the new one's not being used for budget proposals. Our contractor through IHS or BIA, you may need to work with Health Admin or SRD to get any estimates for your upcoming fiscal year so you know what to propose or to include in your proposal. Particularly for these types of grants, new proposals will get presented to council for approval, but when they're approved, they're not uploaded for availability right on October 1st, we have the approval recorded, but then as the continuing resolution funds come in, those are what will actually get budgeted. When we're preparing our budgets, and for a lot of us, we're probably duplicating a lot of what we did each fiscal year, but we need to make sure we're using the chart of accounts correctly for budgeting items. Like a real popular account number we'll use when we're uncertain of something is the 75,500 other tribal program expenses. You know, we have over 200 expense codes in our chart of accounts, so we want to make sure we're classifying our stuff correctly. We don't want to end up budgeting office supplies when we meant to charge fuel for our vehicle. There's an account number separate for that. So let's make sure we're using the right chart of accounts. In Martus, we'll see that when we can get there in a few minutes here. It uses a smart search functionality, so we can actually search for accounts by the number or even by a name. So once we start typing something, we can start to see the options available to us so we can make the right selection. Lynette provided the an email this morning with a breakdown of like the payroll related costs. So here's that again here. So when I send this out to everyone, you'll have that through here or through the memo that Lynette has sent of what the estimates are. So when you're budgeting and planning for your staff costs, you can use this as an estimate on how to budget appropriately. The only thing I want to point out is on the health insurance one, it is $19.55 per month for employees who can use IHS, but for non-IHS employees, basically non-tribal members, the cost is $55 a month. So if you have any employees who are non-tribal members and you're estimating your budget, estimated at $55.96 per employee. So in the worksheets area, we're going to planner and then we're going to worksheets. For our fiscal year 23 budgets, we will not go to change requests. If you prepare it under the change request area, that is not going to be visible to anyone. It will not be included in the aggregate of the budgets that Lynette prepares because it won't be in the same area as all the other budget proposals. So for fiscal year 23's budget proposals, do not go to change requests. We're going to worksheets. I'm already in fiscal year 23, but for most of us, we're going to start in fiscal year 22. So let's make this a little bigger. You're going to have to select that period to 23, and then you can filter to get your year to 23. We'll know that's changed because up top it's going to say draft fiscal year 23 budget, and next to all of our worksheets, it's going to say 2023. So we want to make sure we've done that before we go any further. And then depending on your access, you're going to see probably a different list than what I have access to. So once we've done that, we can then select the proper worksheet we want to work on. So Martus works by worksheets, which is basically the program and checkbook combination. So I'm going to get into the worksheet I'll be using today. And so once we found the one we're going to do, we're going to click the blue edit button. If this is the first time we're logging in to prepare the fiscal year 23 budget, there's a few things we're going to see of note. Number one, our 2022 actuals and budget will be visible, and below that is where FY23 will be. But if we haven't started anything, there'll be nothing to see yet. So right now, this would be totally expected for us not to see a fiscal year 23, even though the top screen says FY23, draft FY23 budget. There's nothing to show until we start adding budgets. If we have actual expenses, they'll populate in these boxes here based on the calendar for fiscal year 22. And the end of the line has what the budgets are in fiscal year 22. Doesn't show any other period, it's just going to be that year. So we won't be able to change this to show a different fiscal year. So while we're looking at our budget and we're getting ready to start fiscal year 23, we want to be aware of the funding sources that are there. So right now we can see there's two different funding sources on screen. There's a test for AR training and then one just called test for training. So if we're going to base our budget on fiscal year 23 on the funds used in fiscal year 22, we need to be aware that that means we're going to have two different funding sources to use. So the first way we can start adding our fiscal year 23 budget, and probably maybe the easiest but most time-consuming way, is at the bottom of this, there's going to be an account and funding source drop-down box. We can simply select an account number and then a funding source to add to our FY23 proposal. If it's going to be similar to what we have up here, when we hit that drop-down box for account, we get a little search box where if I start typing by number, it's going to start looking for matches. Or I can start typing by a word. So if I wasn't sure what the tribal employee's number was, I can start typing employee. And the more I type, the more it's going to start matching what we're trying to look for. So it's giving me 5 different options right now by typing employee. By employee, still 5 different options. So the more we type, the more it'll filter out other numbers or types of accounts that we're looking for. So I've got tribal employees I can select. And then here we do have to select a funding source. So keep that in mind. When you select an account during this period, you do have to pick a funding source. You can't leave it blank. If I left it blank and clicked add line, now that we have an FY23 budget, it's going to have an account number, but the funding source field will be blank. So keep an eye on that when we're adding our accounts manually. If we don't include the funding source, once you save your budget and we have a value here and we save this worksheet, that's not going to update. Martus doesn't run by the same rules as Intact, so that's going to be left blank. And when Lynette goes to prepare the aggregate of all these budget proposals to get to budget and finance, this line's not going to be included. And it won't be accessible in Intact, since Intact requires the funding source. So we need to make sure that we pick a funding source with each line as we're adding manually. And if we're working fast or we forgot to select the funding source and it's blank here, we can correct that by going to the end of the line, selecting the line, or if it's a number of lines, you can click the box multiple times. You can hit action, and on this drop box it says change dimensions. So it's going to let us find that funding source. And now we have a funding source in there. So now we'd be looking good for this getting into Intact. Last year, we would have had to delete the line, then add it again. So there's been some changes in Martus that's going to allow us to be a little more efficient with corrections if they're needed. And it happens. But as we're adding manually, we can do that each time, looking to add whatever the budget is supposed to be for our funding sources. So if payroll taxes is next, we can start finding payroll taxes, finding the funding source and adding the line, and then including whatever the amount's going to be. We want to make sure as we're going through and adding each line, as you're working, especially if you have a lot of funding sources to add, use the save worksheet option every now and then to make sure that just in case you navigate away from the screen, your work is saved. If I left the screen now, the payroll tax line wouldn't be saved. So you don't want all your work to go away. Use that save worksheet frequently just to make sure. If we have a lot of funding sources and we don't want to spend the time having to add our lines one by one, or we have a lot of lines and a lot of account numbers, whatever the reason is, there are other options. So let's look at the second option. This is called load, and it's located at the top. And let's see what happens while I leave these current account numbers and use the next option. At the top of the screen, we have load and initialize. If I hit load, what that's going to do is load the account numbers and the funding sources from the current fiscal year into fiscal year 23. So it's kept the lines and the amounts that I've already started working on, and we've added those other account numbers. So if we had started adding these lines manually and then we decided, yeah, forgot we can just hit load, we can do that. So it's going to include all of those funding sources and all those accounts from FY22. From here, we can make whatever changes we need to by going into each field and adding the amounts that we need to add. If for some reason one of these funding sources were no longer going to be used in FY22, we'd want to make sure we get rid of that funding source before saving our budget or before finishing our work. And just like in the updating part of that, we can go back here, select the lines that we want to get rid of, hit action, and then there's an option to delete those lines. And so that's the load function, which can help us save a lot of time. If we have multiple funding sources, we have a few options here on screen where we can sort stuff by funding source. So by clicking these buttons to sort in ascending or descending order. So now we can see the expenses are now going to be sorted by funding source first and then by account number. Or on the top of the screen, there's going to be an area that says funding source and then filter line items. So if I hit filter line items, here's the two funding sources I have actively on the sheet. If I don't want to see the test for AR training, I can select test for AR training and only have to work with those for right now. Finish the work here and then come back here to either filter again to the next funding source or to exit to go back out to the main view. So if you're a program like Head Start, Early Head Start, where you have 3 active funding sources, this would probably be a much easier way for you to enter these if you're entering them manually. In addition to load, we have the option to initialize worksheet. And what that's going to give us is the option to either use the actual expenditures from FY22 or to use the budget from FY22. I would be careful using your actual numbers because this is going to based on the period of time that you're working on your proposal. So if you started this month, it's not going to include all of your expenditures all the way till today, and it's only going to be part of the year, not a full fiscal year. So if you use your actual numbers as part of your proposal, you may end up under proposing your budget for FY23. So just be aware of that if that's what you're going to choose. If you have your full fiscal year 22 budget in, great. We can hit the use all FY22 budget numbers. All those months get selected, and then we can set a value. If I use 100%, anything that's budgeted in FY22 is going to be budgeted in FY23 for the same amount. I can increase it by 5% by changing to 105 or decrease it by 5% by changing it to 95. Whatever it is I'm proposing to do, if there's going to be a change in which we want to do that to all fields through a percentage change. Or we leave it at 100 because we want it to come and match exactly what FY22 is. We'll do that for now. Hit set values. And so here's the FY22 line for account 41,000, has a budget of $100. And when we go to FY23, there's its budget of $100. And so everything changed to match exactly what was in FY22. Notice that the amounts I've entered for payroll taxes and for tribal employees were changed because we told Martus we want to initialize and match 100% of those funds for FY22. So if you're going to add lines manually or you're going to be a different amount than what was in FY22, we'd want to wait until after you did the initialize part before you add any new lines or make any changes to an existing account number. And if you see this and decide, what I want to do here is actually we want to propose a 3% change in our budget. If we do initialize, use those numbers and change the number to 103%, we can now see 3% has been added to that line. So it was 100 in FY22, now 103 in FY23. And that'd be all the way across the board. So it'd be a relatively easy thing to be able to use and propose. And from there, we could hit save. And as far as preparing the FY23 proposals, we'd potentially be done here. If this line wasn't going to have anything proposed to it, so it's 0, I'd want to come down here, click the checkbox, and delete that line. So that the only things being included in my proposal are the line items being used and the amounts that are being budgeted or proposed. From here, you could export this to save it as an Excel file on your desktop if you needed that to refer back to later. For users, I would ask that you use the Save Worksheet function. If you hit Submit, it's going to lock this worksheet, which would mean if you prepared this and then realized afterwards that you want to make a change, you won't be able to access this worksheet until Lynette, me, or Lori unlock the worksheet so you can go make that change. So don't make it inconvenient to yourself by hitting Submit. Just use the Save Worksheet button. That way, when we hit Save, these fields are still accessible. If we hit Submit, I can't make any changes now until the worksheet's unlocked. And that's just Lori, Lynette, and I that can unlock the worksheet. So just make sure we use and save. Do we have any questions about manually adding an account number or using the load and initialize options at the top? Okay. Someone did ask a question about funds that they're using now or starts before fiscal year 23. If you have a grant that will begin before fiscal year 23, that proposal shouldn't be included with fiscal year 23. You're probably already taking those things through budget and finance and through council to get approval for those to start being used now and not in the next fiscal year. So make sure you're not doing that and then wondering why you're not being able to spend money or access those funds earlier than fiscal year 23. All right, so seeing no other questions come in, so let's talk about importing our budgets. So before we get started, there's some notes I wanted to add to make sure I got these out to everyone. So number one, yes, we can import through a budget spreadsheet, but it is a specific spreadsheet. It's not just an Excel spreadsheet you currently have. I know there's one that Lynette uses that helps with collecting your budgets together. None of those are going to be the ones we can use in Martus. It's a specific spreadsheet. Depending on the amount of lines that we have and the amount of accounts we're using, this might be easier than manually adding every line and funding source. Especially if we have new funding sources that aren't accessible because they weren't used in fiscal year 22. This is going to be a tidier way to do this, so it's time saving. But we do have to be comfortable using Excel. If you're not comfortable using Excel, you might run into some problems with how the spreadsheet has to be formatted or what you need to do to make sure that we're copying and pasting or auto-filling all these lines with the funding source information, that kind of stuff. Should be comfortable with managing files on your computer, because when we get into Martus to upload a budget, we have to pull it off our desktop. Fields are specific, and extra data can cause the spreadsheet to fail to upload. But what that means is, like if we had an account number 55,000 that we're going to use, if we add another number or even extra space to that, that may be recognized as extra characters, and that's not going to match what the system holds. It needs to be exact to what they are. So this is a color-coded one. These are the fields we're pretty much going to use in an Excel spreadsheet. Program ID, funding source ID, checkbook ID, account ID, the month that we're going to add this to. So notice this one says 10/1/2022. There has to be a total column, so which we'd expect those to match since there's just 1 month. And whatever note we're going to use for our proposals. And then we have our program ID. Granted, for my test one, its ID is test, but like finance is 123, and it's whatever the program number is for you that's in intact. The funding source ID is going to be a specific one that we can find in intact or in Martus if the funding source already exists. Here's our checkbook number, and then here's those account numbers. No account names. It's got to be the account number without any additional information. Same thing with our program. If we tried to put our program number 102 alcohol treatment program, Martus will not recognize that. It can only be the number, the ID number. So let's work on proposing a draft. So first thing I'm going to do is delete the thing we just put together because we want to see what it looks like if we're going to prepare an Excel spreadsheet. So I'm going to go ahead and select all those columns and hit delete. I will email the spreadsheet, the template to everybody so you can use that as your resource. It's also on the website I have. So if we go to ljstraining.info and we go to either the Martus area for annual budget prep, there's the download for the import sheet template, or you can go to the documents menu. Under Martus, there's the annual budget import template. So you can find that in 2 spots. Later, if you lose track of the email, I'll send out once the video and the slideshow is available. But that's the one we're going to use. So here's that spreadsheet. If we're going to budget more than 1 month, you want it to budget all 12 months, we would need to have 10/1/22, 11/1/22, and so on to be able to budget for every single one of the months. I'm just going to budget the one, so I'm just going to have the 1 column. I have the program ID, the funding source ID, checkbook, and account numbers. If we're unsure yet what those could be, if we go into Martus, for example, at the top it's going to say checkbook. It's going to have a number and then the name of the checkbook. All Martus is looking for is the number, so we're going to take 35, and that's going to be 35. Same thing for program. Yours, it's going to be a number. It's going to have a number and then your program name. All it's looking for is the actual number. This number is test, so that's the one I have. What funding source or funding sources will you be using? If they currently exist, hey, the name's going to be right there. It's easy to find. If it doesn't exist yet, there's nothing for you that you can put here until you contact the program monitor to get that created first. So if we're at this point, we don't know what our funding source is because it's a new award, we need to stop what we're doing and reach out to whoever the monitor is and ask them for that help to get the new one created. So I've got the funding sources here that I can use just as easy as highlighting the funding source, copying it, and then pasting it into my spreadsheet. We have a question, do revenue funding sources stay the same? Yes, revenue, general, indirect, casino, and multi-year grants will typically all be the same funding source year over year. So now I can bring down that program number, that checkbook number. What is an account number we need to budget? And then what is the amount we're going to budget? The total has to equal whatever the budget's going to be. I have one column, so that's an easy one to match. If we're going to include multiple months in our budget, that total needs to be the sum of all of those months. So we can use a note if we want to include extra information here. You don't have to use a note, but if you wanted to, you can. If we're not making any changes to the amounts, all we got to do is enter them and we're ready to go. And we can save this to our desktop. We want to make sure this tab down here on the bottom still says budget like it does on the template. If we change the text, Martus is going to upload it. It's going to look like it's successful. Then you're going to get an email saying it didn't work. So we want this down here to say budget just as it is in the template. So I'm going to take this off screen so we can look at how to import this. In the same line where we can save, there is an option that says to choose file so we can import budget data. So notice now we have no fiscal year 23 budgets yet because I just deleted the work we did from load and initialize. So we're going to choose a file, find it wherever you're going to save it. So I've got mine on the desktop. Here's that worksheet I'm going to upload. We're going to open that so it's added here. And then we can click the orange import budget data. So now that we're done, there's the budget I've uploaded. So all the same amounts from the spreadsheet have carried over. We know I've entered the funding sources and the account numbers correctly. I programmed correctly. Everything that I'm expecting to show up has shown. And that would be it. If we're done here, we can hit save. Now we have our budget proposed for FY23 by importing it. And we can move to the next thing. And look out on each of the lines, there's a little blue calculator. There's my note that I included with each of the lines. So if we see any of these things where the calculator is blue, we know there's been notes added. Now, if we need to add our supporting documentation, because we finished preparing the proposal, let's look at, I summarized Lynette's memo, so hopefully I got everything here. But supporting documentation for our proposals are going to be things that support the revenue sources that we're including, our matching requirements so that our budget isn't imbalanced, contract grant periods, award letters if we have those at that point, 1, 3, 5-year plan including mission statements, scope of work, budget justifications, job descriptions, inventory, organizational chart, and future needs of the program. All of that needs to be included with our proposals. And revenue generating department should include historical and supporting data for your proposal. So I think, Lynette, does that about cover everything you're looking for that should be submitted with your proposals through Martus? All right, she says, yep. So we got that covered. So all of these things we're going to want to include with our worksheet proposal. So in Martus, at the very bottom of the worksheet is an area that says files. And just like we did with the import budget data, we're going to have to choose a file. So if this was one of my supporting documentations here, this Sioux Tribe email access memo, I can select the one, add it, and then click upload. So the page will refresh, and now that PDF is available. We can upload multiple attachments. So if I needed another one, I can hit choose file, go on to the next one. So if it's this natural resources PDF, find that and upload that too. And so now if that were the two things that I needed for this proposal, they're both available. Lynette can access those and make those available to Budget and Finance or to Council. When we're adding these attachments, we can't select, unfortunately, multiple things at a time. So we're going to have to add each attachment one at a time. So easy enough to add all the attachments that we need. And Lynette also wants to remind everyone that please remember that no hard copies or flash drives need to be turned into the finance department. So we want those all to be included through Martus. And yes, in the past, we could only upload one file. So that's another change that Martus has made on worksheets, not on budget mods. On worksheets, we can include multiple files. So if you have your budget justification as one document, your grant and contract stuff as another document, and then your mission statement, all that as a third document, you can upload all three. Okay. That's all I wanted to go through were those three different ways we can include or add our proposals for FY23, whether it's manually adding line by line, using the load and initialize option, or using the template to import our budget. Those are the three ways we'll get the budget into Martus. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day.